I'm here to say that the evidence suggests that we will be the ones having to fight that fight when it really comes down to it. We're the barrier between the globalists and total world control or their new world order. We're the obstacle. I don't think that there's anyone else.
Hey friends, before we dive into the deep end with Brandon Smith, I just want to let you know that Apple has transferred Chinese users' iCloud data to state-controlled data centers. This trillion-dollar market cap company is doing some pretty despicable things despite the concerns from human rights activists. And this incident shows what could come to the United States as it pertains to government overreach. This is why we encourage all our listeners to use Virtual Shield VPN while browsing the internet, so such overreaching and tyrannical institutions cannot accurately track your personal and private data. Virtual Shield is by far one of the best VPNs in the world, and their no-log policy guarantees ultimate privacy and anonymity to its customers. And this month, Virtual Shield will be giving away a 1-year free subscription to their flagship product, IdentiSafe, for customers who choose to purchase an annual membership to the Virtual Shield VPN. So check out the link below this video. You have the right to remain private. I started my channel talking about economics, sound monetary policy, gold, silver, real money. And today we're going to return to some of that talk, but we'll certainly delve into the deep state topics of the day as well. And this interview is actually by request from one of my longtime readers who said, can you please get Brandon Smith from altmarket.com on? We're doing that right now, and it's my pleasure to welcome Brandon Smith. How are you, Brandon?
Oh, I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell people a little bit about your background? And you are the founder of altmarket.com, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I've been writing for the Liberty Movement for about 12 years now, since around 2006. I do economic analysis, mostly macroeconomic analysis and geopolitical analysis, and that's what I do. So I started with neithercorp.us back in 2006, and I moved on in 2010 to altmarket.com, and I've been writing for altmarket.com ever since.
Well, it's funny that we've never talked because we're probably aligned in many ways as libertarians. I think essentially probably smaller government is better government, and certainly a government by the people is the government we demand, not a government by and for corporations. And I noticed here in your latest article, Trump versus the Fed, America sacrificed at the NWO altar, and you show essentially the American flag being offered to Moloch in a sacrifice. I think that illustration here is apropos for a number of reasons, not the least of which is this Hollywood and DC pedogate story continues to roll out, where literally a lot of the people in positions of power do seem to enjoy abusing and in many cases sacrificing children. So we could talk a little bit about pedogate if you'd like, but let me start by reading this headline from Zero Hedge. And I think this is actually noteworthy and a great segue into your article. Trump declares war on the Koch brothers. Their network is highly overrated. I have beaten them at every turn. They want to protect their companies outside the U.S. from being taxed. I'm for America first and the American worker, a puppet for no one. Do you agree with that statement from President Trump? Brandon, do you think he's a puppet for no one? Or at least is he a lot better than Hillary Clinton?
Well, I would say that if Hillary Clinton had entered the Oval Office, I would say the decline of the United States would be happening a little bit faster. Unfortunately, with Donald Trump, as far as the puppet claim goes, I'm not convinced. Unfortunately, he has invited a number of Goldman Sachs alumni, JP Morgan alumni, and Council on Foreign Relations alumni into his cabinet. And as far as I can see, those people are haunting the halls of the White House, and they're over the shoulder of Trump 24/7. So is he, the original claim was, did he invite these people in to, because they have experience in the Beltway and he's using them, or are they using him? I would say, given the history of these people and their exploitation of various presidents, I would say that it's more likely that they're using him.
And let me ask you this here, as it relates to your article. Do you believe that the plan is that America will be sacrificed at the New World Order altar? Do you think that that is what's in process here? Because, you mentioned that the plan certainly would have been fast-tracked under Hillary Clinton. We have that statement from Weather Underground infiltrator Larry Grothwall that the plan was to introduce a Marxist communist government and to usurp the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I think Hillary Clinton would have been the final nail in our coffin and would have actually fast-tracked that specific plan. And Larry Grothwall said that people would have to be re-educated in this country. And by the Weather Underground's own estimates, as many as 30 million people who couldn't be re-educated would have to be terminated. Now, that seems like hyperbole. That seems too crazy to be true. But if we look at communist regimes throughout history, that's exactly what happens. Do you think it could have been that bad under a Hillary Clinton presidency?
I think under Clinton we would have been in immediate war. So that's what I mean by fast tracking a collapse. If America enters into another regional war, either with Iran, North Korea, or God forbid, Russia or China, then our economy would collapse immediately. Our economy cannot handle that amount of debt expenditures at this time. So I would say that would fast track the collapse of the United States. Under Trump, who knows if we will enter into war or not. I think under this particular president, what's happening is that the globalists see an opportunity to collapse the economy in a more controlled way. I call it a controlled demolition of the American economy. They can collapse it in a controlled way and then blame it on conservatives in general, blame it on Trump, blame it on conservatives in general, blame the economic collapse which they created on conservative ideals and ideology.
Let me read this paragraph from your latest, Trump versus the Fed, America Sacrificed at the New World Order Altar. You wrote, "Globalists do not care about maintaining the U.S. system as it is. They are even willing to undermine it in order to create the chaos needed to generate social and political capital, the kind of capital that will buy them a worldwide economic reset and their so-called New World Order. Within this construct, the masses would be made to accept open centralization of financial and political control into the hands of a minority of banking elites. That is to say, the globalists no longer want to be covert. They prefer to be overt and venerated as saviors of humanity rather than despised as an organized cancer." All right, you and I both know that the Federal Reserve is a central bank, and above them sits the BIS, the IMF, the World Bank. People are waking up to this fact. Do you honestly think that there's any chance that these literal demons, these demonic entities that usurp governments and sit atop all of it, could ever be venerated as saviors by humanity? I think too many people are waking up.
Well, I would love to be that optimistic. I really would. I'm not allowing myself to be that optimistic yet. I think that working in the liberty movement for so long, it's easy to start to believe or to assume that everyone is privy to the same information that we are. And I think more and more people are. And I want to preface by saying that ultimately I do not believe that the globalists will win. I think that their plan is flawed. And I've written a number of articles about why their plan is flawed. However, that's not going to stop them from making the attempt for the global economic reset and their what they call the New World Order. And in that attempt, I do believe that they are going to, first and foremost, they're going to collapse the U.S. economic system. And they're going to do it on Trump's watch more than likely. And that they are going to try to make a scapegoat of what they call populists or nationalists. That once the crisis evolves and people are suffering, they are going to find a scapegoat, and they're going to point the masses at that scapegoat, and that scapegoat will be nationalists, populists, liberty advocates, individualists, anyone who is a sort of primary threat to globalism. They're going to try to turn the tables and shift their crimes around to us, and this is, if you've studied fourth generation warfare, this would be a classic strategy within fourth generation warfare. This is I think their plan. Will they be successful? I can't say. I think that if we can have at least 10% of the population awake and aware of this information, then I think we can turn the tables back on them. I think that we can win if we are lucky enough to have 10% of the population fully awake and aware and privy to this information. If we have 1% of the population or 2% or something like that, then I don't know. I don't think it's going to go our way. But as far as the masses waking up, I do see that process. It's just that when you have a crisis and you have people suffering within that crisis, people tend to stop thinking rationally and they start looking for someone to blame. And I believe the globalists are going to hand us over to the masses as someone to blame.
Now, here's what's interesting. I'm nodding as you're saying these things because I'm thinking just a couple of years ago, 3 years, 2 years back, before the election, I believe that was exactly what was going to happen as well. And I'm nodding because if Hillary Clinton had been in the White House, everything you just described could have easily been fast-tracked, and everything, including the narratives, could have been more easily manipulated because she would have been in the presidency. She would have controlled the Department of Justice. She would have still had her seventh floor shadow government over there at the State Department, which has, by the way, since been dismantled by Trump. One of the things that brings me so much hope is that the left has completely lost control of the narrative, so much so that even people who previously considered themselves hardcore liberals are now walking away because they don't want to be associated with the far George Soros left, Antifa left, violence of the left, open borders left, and they're literally walking away and coming back towards a more centrist, populist version of politics. And I'm hopeful because what you described is what has been happening for a very long time. The SPLC has been demonizing libertarians, constitutionalists, those that believe in the sovereignty of our nation and nations in the EU, by the way, people like Nigel Farage, constantly demonized as being ideologues or bigots. But they're losing total control of that narrative as people are now rallying around the idea that our country is a great country. We should have a lawful immigration system, and people on the left and right are agreeing on some very, very basic principles, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, all of which would have been burned or offered to Moloch by Hillary Clinton. That's what gives me hope.
Well, I agree that there's certainly a lot of hope as far as waking up. This is definitely an opportunity or a window of opportunity to wake up more and more people. Where I would take exception is that the difference between the past, when we have been demonized, and today is that we now have a president in the White House. We now have a figurehead who is in the White House, who the globalists can wrap all of the world's problems, around his neck and around our necks at that point, because we've all thrown in, with this figurehead, and they can wrap all the future problems that, including economic collapse, which I do believe will happen under Trump's watch, and throw us over the bridge, into the water. So the difference between today and the past is that we now have a symbol in the White House. We have a leader, and the globalists can use that figurehead as a means to scapegoat us more effectively, because in the past we didn't have any power. We didn't have any political or social power beyond the alternative media. Now we supposedly have our man in the White House, and that changes everything as far as the dynamic and as far as who the globalists can blame. If they had tried to blame us 3 or 4 years ago for an economic collapse, it would have sounded absurd. People would think that was ridiculous. Those people have no political power. Today, we supposedly have all the political power, so blaming us for an economic collapse would be very easy. Again, I don't know that they will be successful. I think that if we can educate enough people with this information, at least 10% or more of the population, with all the facts, not just, the left is bad, the right is good, because that's kind of where most people are right now. But if we can educate them on all the facts, then we can turn the tide, even if there is an economic collapse. Really, uh, my hope lay in rebuilding the system. I don't have any hope that the collapse will not happen or that there will not be a major economic decline. I believe, according to the fundamentals and the math, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen under Trump's watch. Um, my hope lay in rebuilding, rebuilding from the ashes, and whoever gets to rebuild determines the future. Either it's going to be the globalists or it's going to be us, and we have to make sure that it's us.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think it is very hard to look at the math and not see a collapse of our financial system coming at some point. Many of us have predicted it would have come by now. You've got John Williams, the esteemed economist, over there saying that hyperinflation would have reared its ugly head by 2016. We're now sitting here in 2018, and I want to ask you this here about that Rothschild Economist magazine from 1988, which predicted in 2018 a world currency. And it showed that phoenix rising from a burning pile of fiat, and around the phoenix's neck was a gold medallion. I want to ask you what you think this crash could lead to, and I want to ask you what the vision is of the elite. You've already said it in this interview, and I'll summarize here by reading the last paragraph, part of the last paragraph of your article. You wrote, "Make no mistake, what we are witnessing is fourth-generation warfare on the public. The goal? To convince the masses that sovereign nationalism leads to planetary disaster. And the only solution is to hand over economic and political power to a centralized authority of financial high priests with a direct line to the god of fiscal stability." Friends, again, the good news is they're trying this in the EU, and nation states are rebelling. They want all of this. This is exactly what they're doing in the EU, and Hungary's rebelling, Poland's rebelling, Spain, the people in Spain are getting ticked, Germany's ready to burn down. Brandon, I just want your thoughts on what you think the model could possibly be for these demonic bankers to use, given this global awakening. And I do believe Q is right when he says there's a great awakening. I think there's a great awakening of people starting to understand what true liberty means and who the forces are opposed against it. How could they get away with crashing our system and then ushering in a one world currency? Do you think that's still part of the playbook?
Well, it depends on, I suppose, your position on Russia and China. If you believe that Russia and China are actually anti-globalist, then you're not going to be convinced by my position. If you are privy to the history of Russia and China with the IMF and the BIS, and the fact that Russia and China have consistently called for the IMF to take control of the global monetary system and institute the SDR as the new world reserve currency. If you're privy to that information, then you know that Russia and China work closely with the globalists, and that is the future that's the future they hope for as far as the new world order. Russia, China, working closely with countries such as Germany, are building sort of a core group of nations in which there will be a new sort of monetary regime that cuts out the US dollar, and I believe will replace it partially with the SDR. But as the IMF has been saying on their own website recently, their sort of future vision is for a global cryptocurrency. They've even sort of referenced cryptocurrency as a evolutionary, the evolutionary future of the global monetary system. So I believe what the central banks are working towards is a global cryptocurrency system, most likely built upon the special drawing rights basket that the IMF controls. China and Russia have both called for the IMF to institute this system, and I suppose they plan for the IMF to continue to control it. They have never said otherwise. So that's the system that I'm talking about when I'm referring to the global reset. That's the system I'm referring to. It's going to include Russia, China, Germany is closely involved with Russia and China in this sort of core group of countries. And I would say that, if we see a collapse in the United States, and I believe we will, if we see a collapse of the dollar, then I think you will start to see suggestions coming from multiple countries, including those that I listed, calling for the IMF to take control of the global monetary system. And I believe that you will see calls for cryptocurrency to be issued as the new world reserve.
All right, and I want to ask you about cryptos here when we round out the conversation, but let me just ask you this as it relates to the possibility that different factions have been at war here. We've got this old New World Order model led by George H.W. Bush, who spoke more than 200 times as president about a new world order coming into focus. I think we know the factions that he represented, and I believe it's that Rothschild elite banking faction, which many people, like my recent guest Adam Green, believes still has full spectrum dominance. I would like to believe that what we're seeing here is a shift, a geopolitical shift away from that death and debt paradigm and towards something different. Let me read you this from LaRouche PAC. My friend Harley Schlanger works for them, and the article's called Emergence of a New Just World Economic Order is Taking Place. British coup operation against U.S. must end. I'll just read you a part of this. The import of the 10th annual summit of the BRICS nations in South Africa last week is that the emergence of a new world economic order is taking place. This was manifest in the statements and actions of the heads of state of China, Russia, India, and others, but also reflected in the engagement of the BRICS plus guest nations of the Global South outreach, which systematically represented all the major regional economic communities across the southern hemisphere. Here's my question for you, and I'll cite Putin as one example. He's an Orthodox Christian, and under his regime, under his presidency, Christianity has flourished and spread all over Russia. We see the opposite happening in our country. We see the opposite happening in the EU. Do you think it's possible that this old world death and debt paradigm, as exemplified by George H.W. Bush, the Rothschilds, and John Perkins really admitting what the playbook was? It was that economic hitman playbook. And what we're seeing out of China and Russia and the BRICS is they want to make investments in nations as opposed to enslave nations and steal all of their resources. Do you think that there's any possibility in that being true, that we're just seeing the death throes of that Rothschild death and debt model?
Well, again, I mean, it's something I would love to believe. It definitely is. Unfortunately, again, the rumors of for example, rumors of Putin kicking the Rothschilds out of Russia are greatly exaggerated. If you look at Rothschild operations around the world, you will see that the Rothschilds continue to operate in Russia. Rothschilds continue to run banking syndicates out of Russia. You can look it up. You can look it up as far as Russian banks. You can just Google Russian banks, Rothschild. You will find that they operate all over Russia. You have Goldman Sachs closely advising the Kremlin and the Russian government as far as their economic models and economic policy. You have Henry Kissinger, close friends with Putin, and also on an economic advisory council for the Kremlin. So I see no evidence that the Russians in particular, or even China, I could go through China as well, but none of the BRICS are separating themselves from the global bankers in the way that I've heard described. And until I see that happening, until I see Putin locking up Kissinger or booting Goldman Sachs out of the Kremlin, until I see that, I just can't bring myself to believe that they are truly anti-globalist. That, along with their close ties to the IMF and the BIS, and continuing to call for a global monetary system under the control of the IMF. I just don't see that separation. Until I do, I can't hold out hope that there is going to be a national resistance to the globalist model. I really think that a lot of people, they want to believe that there will be a resistance on a national or a governmental scale against the globalist plan for the New World Order. I really think they want to believe that because it's terrifying. The idea that we will have to, the common man will have to fight this fight ourselves is terrifying to people. And so they want to believe that someone else will fight that fight for them. I'm I'm here to say that the evidence suggests that we will be the ones having to fight that fight when it really comes down to it. We're the barrier between the globalists and total world control or their new world order. We're the obstacle. I don't think that there's anyone else.
I don't completely disagree with you at all here. In the part where I would argue with you just a little bit that I think Trump really is trying to return the government to the people is just the really basic example of the fact that he did dismantle Hillary Clinton's seventh floor shadow government. But, until we see people like George Soros arrested for treason and sedition, until we see people like Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, Debbie Wasserman Schultz tried for their crimes, I continue to only see our cup as half full, not completely full. And you're absolutely right about Henry Kissinger. We'll recall that it was George Bush and Dick Cheney who wanted to put Henry Kissinger in as the chairman of the 9/11 Commission and completely cover it up. Of course, it was covered up anyway. And it's one of the moments in history that led to my awakening, was learning about 9/11 and what really happened that day. So as we round out this conversation, let's talk about cryptos, gold, and silver. You mentioned cryptos as being one of the things that when the crash happens, the powers that be will tell the people to turn to cryptos. Where do we stand? Where do you stand on cryptos? Is it something people should take a look at as having as part of their portfolio? And are you still a big gold and silver guy in physical form?
Well, I guess as far as cryptocurrencies go, I've pretty much always said that if they can find a way to back cryptos with a tangible commodity, then I would support them. Otherwise, I can't really support it because it, ultimately, a cryptocurrency is something that anyone can ultimately create. Anyone can learn to make a cryptocurrency. Therefore, you have a massive number, potentially already we have thousands of cryptocurrencies. We could have thousands upon thousands more. And, so what sets one cryptocurrency apart from another? What makes one worth more than the other? Well, Bitcoin is worth more than the others so far because it was the first. But, as far as attributes, what makes one worth more than the other? And I just don't see any difference until someone backs one with a tangible commodity such as gold or silver or oil or whatever, like the Venezuelans are doing. The problem with the Venezuelans is they're all communists, so it's not necessarily a trustworthy cryptocurrency. So as far as that goes, again, tangible backing for a crypto is where I kind of draw the line. In terms of, you mentioned earlier the Rothschild run The Economist magazine and their article in 1988 talking about a global currency system. What I see today is actually, they were calling for it in 2018, and I actually see that what they described in 1988 being implemented now. But more subversively, I see it being implemented through cryptocurrency systems and through blockchain systems, and the public sort of being almost indoctrinated into thinking that this is the way things have to go, that ultimately cryptocurrencies and the blockchain system are trustworthy, and that this is the future evolution of the monetary system, as the IMF calls it. Now, are any one of the existing cryptocurrencies, will one of those become the ultimate global currency that the elites want? I don't know. I do see banks like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, I see the IMF all working on cryptocurrency systems. So maybe they will introduce a new system post, economic decline or post collapse that is completely under their control. I've we can argue. I suppose Bitcoin proponents and others will argue that that's not possible. That the blockchain system prevents that, and we can argue that. I have plenty of points on that. That idea that cryptocurrencies can't be controlled. I believe they can be, but as far as the 1988 article from The Economist, I think they're dead on. I think they're actually implementing the plan that they described in that article right now, and it's based on the blockchain. And the IMF and global banks, international banks such as Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are all working on that system, and I believe they will put forward a cryptocurrency system post-collapse.
Now, where does gold and silver fit into the picture in your mind for the common man? You mentioned Venezuela, and certainly the hyperinflation in Venezuela has devastated the average person. It's devastated the entire country. And if you had some physical silver or physical gold and you lived in Venezuela, you could feed your family. Is that all it's good for at this point? I mean, have they demonetized silver to the point where it'll never go back above 20 bucks an ounce? Or do you foresee a future at some point, after some sort of crash happens at some point in the future and the U.S. dollar tanks, do you see gold and silver having a lot of value for those who hold it in physical form?
Well, I do. I do believe that gold and silver will increase in value exponentially after a crisis ensues in the markets. And the reason I believe that is because I see both China and Russia stockpiling gold like crazy. They've expanded their gold holdings by a massive amount just in the past 2 years. So I believe Russia even surpassed China recently as the biggest gold buyer in the past 2 years. So I believe they know something that we don't as far as gold and silver is concerned, and I believe what they know is that I believe they know what most global investors don't know as far as gold and silver, and that is that the U.S. dollar system is about to take a nosedive, that the U.S. dollar is about to lose its world reserve status, and that in that process, markets will crash and that gold and silver will skyrocket. So when I look at what other countries' central banks are doing, I see them preparing for a crash. When I look at what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing, I see them creating a crash. So I would say gold and silver is the way to go in terms of protecting your savings. Also, if you look at the crash and say the hyperinflationary crash in Weimar Germany, you'll notice that if you look at the actual raw data of gold prices versus the collapse of the German mark, you'll see that gold actually expanded its value way faster than the German mark collapsed in value. So a lot of people made money off of gold. They about doubled their money off of gold during that hyperinflationary collapse. A lot of arguments against gold are that, well, gold is just all it does is protect your savings. It holds its value. You're never going to make money on it during hyperinflation. That's not true. If you look at certain historical examples, including Weimar Germany, a lot of people made money during that event. So I would say gold and silver are definitely still excellent options. The issue now is that the markets are suppressed through the paper markets, through ETFs and silver and gold paper markets, leading people to believe that there's more silver and gold out there being traded than actually exists. Now, when you have a crisis event, what you'll see is a lot of people demanding physical gold and silver instead of playing around with paper gold and silver in the market. And when that happens, you'll have a lot of people finding out that there is not enough gold and silver, physical gold and silver, to fill those paper contracts, and that's when you'll see gold and silver skyrocket.
Yeah, I agree with you. And when you mention fourth generation warfare, this is exactly what's been going on with gold and silver, because what they've done with this suppression is they have demoralized the average investor from wanting anything to do with silver and gold. Even those of us who have been buying it for a long time and have a ton of silver and some gold, it's not a very compelling story when the price never ever rises. And it actually inhibits a person from wanting to buy more. And of course, the general public doesn't want anything to do with it. And isn't that just the art of war? They'll demoralize us to the point where nobody will have any protection from hyperinflation because the general public won't own any gold and silver, and that will be the best way to bring the people of this nation to their knees. So I hope you're wrong. I think you may be right, and I'm really glad that we had this conversation, Brandon. Thank you so very much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.
All right, and just to remind folks, shout out the website and tell people how they can find you online.
Well, they can visit me at alt-market.com. That's alt-market.com. I write on economics, I write on geopolitics, I write on survival and preparedness, and they can come on down and hopefully they're entertained and informed.
Very good. Well, you've been a great guest, and I appreciate your time. And guys, thank you so much for tuning in. You know how much we appreciate your support. A special shout out to my patrons over at patreon.com. You've been a game changer for me and my little team. Thank you so much for keeping us in the fight for truth. And thanks for visiting us for real news 24/7 at sgtreport.com. God bless.